Hey, it's Connor here from Invictous Yugioh, and I'm here to talk about GOAT format, which was the format that took place in 2005, in between the Lost Millennium releasing and before Cybernetic Revolution. So one thing I'm going to talk about before we go into this is a card called Universe, which came out in the Collector Tin Wave 2, and was not legal at the time, but in most of GOAT tournaments that happen right now, it is considered a playable card. So just keep that in mind when I go through the deck lists. So what you're looking at right now is Standard GOAT, where it incorporates a lot of the things that make GOAT good, as well as elements of Flip-Flop GOAT, which I'll talk about later. The notable things to see about Flip-Flop GOAT is that it's fairly standard, but it runs cards like Creature Swap, and it runs 3 Scapegoats. So with this deck list, I'm actually going to talk about most of the cards in the deck and also some other options. So some of the cards that came out originally that were really strong in this format that you don't see so often now are cards like Knight Parshtath, which was really good at. It was one of your main cards you want to see when your opponent has goats on the field, because it inflicts piercing damage, and when you deal damage to your opponent, you draw a card. So your opponent would set up goats, and then you would summon this card, and you would deal 1900 to them and draw a card. So it was incredibly powerful. Azure Priestess is another card. Azure Priestess was somewhat popular. It wasn't seen in every deck, but since it can attack all monsters on your opponent's side of the field, it could easily clear out an entire goat token summon. BLS was also another really popular card because it was pretty much the boss monster of pretty much every goat deck that could run it. And its ability to banish was really good because there were a lot of floaters that were out, like Sangan at the time, so it was used more for that effect. Breaker was another really good card because in GOAT format, because we had Heavy Storm legal, people would only set 1 or 2 trap cards, and Breaker was a really good way of summoning a card and popping a card that might have been troublesome, like Call the Haunted or Mirror Force, something that you really wouldn't be able to stop if you didn't have Spell and Trap card destruction. DD Warrior Lady, again, was a really good card because not only could it deal with bigger monsters like Jinzo or BLS, but it could also stop the floater cards like Sangan. Again, so Universe has the ability to decrease its attack by 400 but deal piercing. It's the same idea as Knight Parshtath, where you want to pierce through the goats, but since it standardly has 1800 attack and 1900 defense, there aren't very many cards in the format that could get over it. Jinzo is another really good card because Jinzo in conjunction with Call of the Haunted was really strong because it pretty much summoned it and Call of the Haunted just disappeared because it negated Call of the Haunted, so even if your opponent was to Heavy Storm later in the game, Jinzo still wouldn't die. And its 2400 attack is probably one of the highest you'll see in GOAT format. Magician of Faith was another really strong, smaller card that was in the format, because we had some really strong power spell cards in the game, like Delinquent Duo, Pot of Greed, Metamorphosis. Magician of Faith was not only a Thousand Eyes target, but it's also a card that lets you recycle some of these power cards. Morphing Jar was really good because it lets you stay in the game, so if your opponent had a card advantage on you, Morphing Jar could easily more even out the advantage, because if your opponent had 5 cards in hand and you had 2 cards in hand, it would even up the card advantage. And it also lets you recycle your hand. So if you had a really brick hand that had maybe 2 or 3 Scapegoats or 2 or 3 Book of Moons in it, you could easily recycle your hand and draw a better hand. There was also a really good technique where you set all of your cards and then you Morphing Jarred, so your opponent would have to discard a bunch of cards from their hand, but you wouldn't have to discard any. So Sangan, one of the other big cards in the format, the fact that there are very few cards that could deal with the floater meant that you almost always resolved your effect, and usually your target was Sinister Serpent. And Sinister Serpent was incredible in this format because your opponents would run cards like Spirit Reaper, which would try and put you at a hand disadvantage, but Sinister Serpent would pretty much stop that. And the way it works in conjunction with cards like Lightning Vortex and Graceful Charity meant that your inherent disadvantage was actually negated, and it also stopped your opponent's Delinquent Duo from just destroying your hand. So Spirit Reaper was another one of the smaller monsters that was really big. with very little spell and trap card or with very little board clears in GOAT format, Spirit Reaper's effect that it could not be destroyed by battle was incredibly strong. And since it can only be destroyed by cards that target, and there are very few cards in the format that targeted, it was incredibly strong at just stopping your opponent's pushes. Really, the only things that really hit it were cards like BLS and like Snatch Steal. Another card was Tribe Infecting Virus. This was another card that was really good at dealing with goats because you'd call Beast and it would destroy all of your opponent's goats. And it also helped deal with problem cards like Yugioh or BLS or Air Knight. And then the last monster is Tsukiyomi. Tsukiyomi was really good at flipping your monsters, not only your monsters face down, but also your opponent's. So on your side of the field, you could reactivate your Magician of Faiths, your Morphing Jars, stuff like that, but you could also flip down your opponent's like Jinzos and Breakers and be able to attack over them with some of your other bigger normal summonable monsters. And Book of Moon, same idea. It's not only does it let you reactivate your flip effects, but it also can negate an opponent's attack by chaining it to an opponent's attack declaration. And yeah, really good in the format. It let you dodge cards like Ring of Destruction and Snatch Steal, because if you Book of Moon your monster, they wouldn't be able to land. Creature Swap was really good because if your opponent had one monster on the field, you could activate your Scapegoats and then Creature Swap one of your goats with your opponent's monster. And suddenly they have a 0/0 token in attack or defense position, and you have a Air Knight Power Staff or something. So it was really strong. Delinquent Duo was one of the power spell cards of the format. Pretty much the ability for you to pick 2 cards out of your opponent's hand by paying 1,000 life points was incredibly strong, especially if your opponent didn't have Sinister Serpent. Graceful Charity, one of the draw power cards in the deck, incredibly strong, especially if you have Sinister Serpent in your hand, because really this card's a 3 for 3, which is really crazy, but if you have a Sinister Serpent, it's really a 3 for 2. Heavy Storm, one of the most played around cards in the format. One of the reasons why you'll never see someone in GOAT set more than one or two cards at a time is because of the fear for Heavy Storm. One of the things that people did in GOAT format was you set your Heavy Storm and maybe 2 other chainable spell and trap cards, and then your opponent would go, oh, he set 3, he doesn't have Heavy Storm. They'd set a bunch, and then you'd flip your Heavy Storm and chain your cards, and your opponent would lose a lot of advantage. Lightning Vortex, because Dark Hole was banned at the time, and Regeki wasn't out, people played Lightning Vortex instead. So it was pretty much a board wipe, and one of the only spell and trap removal cards that were available in the format. And if you had it with Sinister Serpent, you really weren't losing any advantage. Metamorphosis was another really big card in the format because your ability to turn a GOAT token or a Magician of Faith into a Thousand Eyes Restrict was amazing, and it was one of the main concepts that kind of drove GOAT forward at the time. And Thousand Eyes' ability to steal a monster is incredibly strong. Mystical Space Typhoon, it's really good at destroying problem cards like Snatch Steal, Prima, and Call the Haunted, or any really set back row. It was at 1 at the time, so pretty much everyone runs 1. Nobleman of Crossout is another really good card because you can see that there's a lot of really strong flip effect cards that were available at the time, and Nobleman of Crossout just let you get rid of so many of those cards. And sometimes your opponent would do something like set a Sangan, and if you could knock their set Sangan, it's a huge advantage. Pot of Greed, broken. Not much other than that. +1. Easiest +1 in the game. And with your Magician of Faiths just being able to recycle +1s is really dumb. Prima was really good if you had to like Graceful Charity and discard your Jinzo or something. You can Prima back a card you sent to the grave. And it's just really strong for paying 800 life points. Scapegoats. Really good defensive walls, metamorphosis targets, pretty much not only defensive but also really good utility card. Snatch Steal was really good because you have tribute summon monsters and Book of Moons. You could steal your opponent's monster and then tribute their monster for a Jinzo or something, and then they lose 1,000. So it's like a one-sided Snatch Steal if you have the other half of the combo. Bottomless was really good because it hit cards like BLS, Air Knight, Exarian, Azure Priestess, really anything that really wrecked your board, and its ability to really stop your opponent's big pushes was really important at the format because it was so slow. Call the Haunted, really strong for pretty much the same reason as Prima is. Maybe not as strong because you have to set it for a turn, but still a really good card. Dust Tornado is just a really bad MST, but because MST was so important and it was at 1, people still ran Dust just to make up for it. Mirror Force was also at 1 at the time, and it was incredibly strong because if your opponent was trying to mount a big offensive, Mirror Force was really your only way of stopping it if you don't have something like Torrential. And really, it not only the fact that it was in the game stopped a lot of players from just summoning a bunch of monsters and trying to attack for the fear of the Mirror Force. Ring was also a really good card during the format because it not only did it remove a card on the field, but it also could at times win you the game. With the recent errata, it works a little bit differently, but when you're playing GOAT, you play with the old errata, where pretty much you can kill your opponent, and the damage is simultaneous. So you can either tie if you ring like a BLS while you're both at low health, or you can kill your opponent by targeting their Exarian or something. Sakuretsu was also really good. It wasn't as good as Mirror Force, but Sakuretsu was also not limited. So it was good just because you could stop something like a BLS or an Azure Priestess from just destroying your entire field. Torrential, again, really good at stopping your opponent's big pushes. The format was slow, so sometimes your Torrential would only be like a 2-for-1 or a 2-for-2 or something. But it was still really good if your opponent drops a BLS on you and you can just Torrential it. Now I'm going to go into some cards that I don't personally play, but I think that they're really good in some and are good in some decks. Big Shield Gardna. It's really good because 2600 defense is ridiculous in this format, so really you'd need 1 or 2 card outs. And also its ability to negate a targeting effect and to change it to face-up defense is really good because it kills your opponent's Nobleman crossouts. And because you're playing 3 Book of Moon, just being able to keep putting it in defense and keep putting up a big wall for your opponent is really strong. Blade Knight's probably one of my favorite cards in the format, even though I don't think it's that competitive. The ability to stop your opponent's flip effects from activating is really strong when your opponent has like a set Morphing Jar or set Magician of Faith, because it really destroys your opponent's plans. And also when you only have 1 card in your hand or 0 cards in your hand, it becomes 2000 attack, which is probably one of the strongest monsters at the time. DD Assailant. It's pretty much the same concept as Warrior Lady, except a little bit weaker because you have to have it be destroyed. So it's bigger body but less utility, so I prefer to play DD Warrior Lady over it. Dekoichi, another one of the flip effect monsters. Flip effect draw cards +1. It's pretty good, especially if you're playing 3 Book of Moons. Exiled Forces is really good at popping your opponent's 1 or 2 back row so that you can attack for game. Not my favorite card, but I've seen a lot of people play it to some excess. Magical Merchant, pretty good considering it's another one of the +1 cards. I don't personally like it because you can end up milling some of your good monsters, like BLS and Jinzo and stuff, which if you don't have the revival to bring it back, wouldn't be as strong. Some of the decks really make good use of it, but I don't think this is one of them. Giant Shrunade pretty much had the same idea as being able to push for game, where if you have a BLS on the field, you really want to clear the way, so you'd make sure your opponent doesn't have Mirror Force or Sakuretsu Armor, so you would Giant Shrunade, and it also has some really good synergy with cards like Premature Burial. So more Nobleman crossouts. Sometimes more is better, especially when your opponent's playing a lot of flip cards like Dekoichi. Smashing Grounds. When your opponent only has 1 monster, Smashing Grounds is pretty much just a 1-card removal, and is really strong if your opponent has like 1 Jinzo on the field and that's the only card they have. Swords is really good. Swords pretty much just stops your opponent from attacking and lets you set up a big field and attack them. And Ceasefire. Ceasefire is really good just for the extra burn damage. Now onto the extra deck. A lot of the cards in here are situational, and they're just extra metamorphosis targets that you will never really see. Cards like a Dark Fire Dragon or Gatling Dragon. But I'm going to kind of highlight all of them and their strengths and the opportunities to use them. Thousand Eyes Restrict is probably the most significant of the cards you'll metamorphosis into. Its ability to steal an opponent's monster is ridiculous. Even stealing a face-down monster is still really good. And the fact that that cards can't switch their battle positions stops your opponent from activating flip effects, which is pretty good. Last Warrior from Another Planet. It's an incredibly situational card. The only time I've ever resolved it is when my opponent's playing an anti-goat deck, and I've been able to creature swap his monster and metamorphosis, because in this deck you're not playing a level 7 that you can metamorphosis. But if you can summon it, it is ridiculous. It is one of the strongest fusion cards in the game. Ryu Senshi pretty much is your Jinzo. If you need to metamorphosis your Jinzo for some reason, Ryu Senshi is your target. It's really not the strongest card in the game, but it's pretty much, it works in conjunction with Dark Balter. So Ryu Senshi negates trap cards, and Dark Balter negates spell cards. So if you want to put them both on the field just for the lulz, it's a pretty good soft block. Rabbit Horseman, not actually a card I think that was legal in the format. I just put it in there as an extra 6. Just, I don't know, wanted the extra space. Thought it looked funny. You can fill it in with another level 5 or something. It's not, again, half the extra deck never gets used, so put in whatever you want. Gatling Dragon. Gatling Dragon is your target, your metamorphosis target is BLS. Gatling Dragon's really good if your opponent sees that your heavy is gone and sets a bunch of cards. You can Gatling Dragon and try and wipe their field. Again, very situational. Some decks, it's more situational than others. I run it just why not. Flame Ghost, again, it's one of the why nots. If you need your Sangan search really badly, you can metamorphosis the Sangan, get the Sangan effect when it hits the grave, and summon Flame Ghost. Not incredibly relevant, but it's one of the, you'd be surprised how many times it comes up. Fiend Skull Dragon, another one of the cards that you see sometimes, negates the effects of flip effect monsters, stuff like that. Yeah, but again, it's one of the cards that very rarely comes up. Darkfire, if you need to get rid of one of your 4s, not as important as getting rid of one of your 3s, so you see this card less. Darkblade. Darkblade's actually really good. Some of the decks play Revival, where you see, especially against zombies, this card's relevant, because when your opponent wants to Book of Life, you want to make sure they can't Book of Life, and being able to banish 3 monsters from your opponent's grave can sometimes help. Especially if you know they have a Call of the Haunted and they're trying to bring back something like Jinzo. And Balter, like I said, it negates spell cards pretty good. Considering you play so many more spell cards than trap cards, it sees a little bit more play than Ryu does. And that is it for the standard goat. So I'm going to move on to flip-flop goat. So right off the bat, there's not sorted. Right off the bat, you can see we have main decked 2 Dekoichi, just for the extra draw, and Magical Merchant, because you just want as many flip effects as possible. This deck runs, I think, 6 flip effects, so 2 Dekoichi, 2 Magician of Faith, a Merchant, and a Jar. Really good. Most often I play flip versus flip, so that's why there are 2 Nobleman Crossheads in this deck. We've added in Nobleman Crosshead but taken out a goat, because when you're flipping cards, it becomes a little less relevant to have goats. Your Magician of Faiths usually can recycle you a goat if you need it. And also you're playing Ceasefire, which is pretty good. It stops your opponent's flip effects from activating, and flips them all face up, and then you take burn damage equal to the number of effect monsters on the field. It's pretty good. And cards to note, DD Assailant, you can set it and trick your opponent into attacking into it because you're playing flip goats, and then you banish something like a Jinzo, and it's really good. And the other only card that I think is worth mentioning here is Swords Revealing Light. If you get your Tsukiyomi looping it with something like Magician of Faith, Swords is really good because it really forces your opponent to find a spell and trap card out, or else you're just going to start looping advantage, and it's really strong. And extra deck for all of these decks will be the same. So we're going to move on to Jar Goats, or Jar FTK. And Jar FTK is one of the reasons why I don't like playing Goats at tournaments, because you see it way too much. And the idea of the deck is you and your opponent both draw massive amounts of cards, and you both get both of your decks down to 0 cards, and then you pass the turn, and your opponent has no cards to draw, and they lose. So some of the things to note here is the interaction between Thunder Dragon and Reload. So because Magical Mallet wasn't out yet, Thunder Dragon would give you +1, and you'd add 2 Thunder Dragons to your hand, and then you'd reload, and you would just have 1 more card in your hand to reload away. Pretty much the idea of the deck was you wanted to draw into Morphing Jar or Cyber Jar and start using cards like Book of Moon and Book of Taiyu to start getting multiple effects per turn. And cards like Serial Spell and Spell Reproduction would be used to draw into or copy cards like Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Drag Down, and you really just wanted to loop as many of these effects as possible and just wreck your opponent. And sometimes it's an FTK, sometimes it's a 2-turn kill. It really sometimes works. I've had people tell me it's got a 60% chance of working, 40, 50. It's just not a fun deck to play against, and a lot of GOAT players side against it, and some of the sides against this deck are really nasty, like Electric Snake. So, or actually not Electric Snake. Cards like Rampaging Elephant Statue and stuff like that. So, if you like being a scumbag, this is the deck for you. Again, I have a dying hatred of it, so we'll move on. Machine Goats actually has nothing to do with goats, but I called it goats just for this video. It's really more of a machine deck. We see it's an FTK deck. We have 3 limiter removal, which is hilarious. And yeah, so pretty much it's a pretty plain just kill your opponent. You've got 3 X-Head Cannon because it's just a big beater, BLS, Cannon Soldier, Cyber Jar, just a lot of cards that just deal damage to your opponent. Fun cards like Injection Fairy Lily, which is one of the only machines not in the that's not a machine. The ability for it to become 3400 attack, pretty good. Gets over every other monster in the deck. Yep, fairly standard. Rest of the monsters. Enemy controller was used in conjunction with Last Will. So pretty much Last Will is you'd send a card from your field to the graveyard, and then you'd summon a card from your graveyard, or you'd summon a card with 1500 less attack. So sometimes it'd be you attack, or you enemy controller one of your cards away, and then bring out something like Injection Fairy Lily. It was pretty good. 3 limiter removal, really silly. You can do multiple in a turn. X-Head Cannon gets really big sometimes. And you play Magic Cylinder and Ceasefire just for the extra burn. And Ring as well. This deck doesn't play meta, so you really don't need the extra deck, but I like having an extra deck because then it makes your opponent unsure of what deck you're playing, and also sometimes you want to side meta or something. It becomes relevant. Okay, so the next deck is Monarchs, or Tribute Control, or Soul Control, or whatever you want to call it. This deck pretty much utilizes the card Soul Exchange, which was pretty much the OG Monarch Stormforth, and you would use that in conjunction with cards like Thanatos and Zaborg. And pretty much Zaborg with spot removal, pretty good. and this was just a burn card. So you play Big Shield Gardena, because since it is such a hard card to get over, it lets you start to mass advantage behind it. So you play Gardena, they can't get over Gardena past their turn, and then you can summon a Zaborg or a Thalnos, and it's really good. Or Thesitos, whatever. Yeah, so 3 scapegoats just because you need to make that big wall, swords because you need to make the big wall, double Sakuretsu because you need to make the big wall. Pretty much it just stop your opponent from doing stuff and then summon a bunch of big dudes and get their crazy effects. And it's a really effective deck. I've lost in many tournaments to this deck, and it seems like good players play it a lot. So next is Ninja Goats, or RDD Goats, one of those. Pretty much you're using cards like Strike Ninja, wherever he is, and you banish 2 Darks, and pretty much you want to banish them as much as possible to be able to have a huge return. And then pretty much you use return to kill your opponent. So that's why you're playing cards like Rhoda, because you want to find that Strike Ninja as fast as possible. And your ability to loop Gravekeepers, or be able to go +1 with your Gravekeeper Spy into a guard, or Spy into another Spy, allows you to fill up your grave with Dark-type monsters. And you play a few light targets like Warrior Lady and Parshdath and Magician of Faith, just so you have targets for your BLS. Yeah. Other notable cards, Deck Dev is played just because of your sheer number of Darks, and because you have cards like Zambria, which is a Deck Dev target, and stuff like that. Really solid. I do like Don Zalug in this deck. It's funny sometimes. Yeah. You're also playing Ceasefire just because it's an OTK deck with return. If return doesn't kill them, you Ceasefire them when they summon an effect monster, and it's usually pretty strong. Again, not a deck that runs meta, but I put a side deck anyway, or an extra deck anyways. And finally is Zombies. So you play Zombies. It's fairly straightforward. This is Zombies before zombies were a thing, before things like Zombie Master and stuff came out. Pretty much the whole idea of the deck is Zombie Lord, and so you play Giant Rat, which goes into Pyramid Turtle, which goes into Zombie Lord. If you start Giant Rat, it's really good. If your opponent summons a 1500 attack monster, you summon Giant Rat, and then you crash, summon another Giant Rat, crash, summon a Pyramid Turtle, crash, summon a Pyramid Turtle, crash, summon a Pyramid Turtle, and then you've thinned your deck by 5 cards. And one of the things to note is you never want to call monsters if you don't know where your opponent's Sinister Serpent is, because your Vampire Lord can very quickly become a +1 for your opponent if they just send Sinister Serpent to the grave and then it gets added back to their hand. So, other than that, pretty straightforward. You play 2 Spirit Reaper because it's a zombie. You play a bunch of cards to search into Zombie Lord, or search into Vampire Lord. And you played Book of Life, because Book of Life's really good. And, yeah. I don't change the composition of my extra deck up at all, even though you are playing more 5s than usual. I still like to keep my extra deck. Again, the extra deck's not really relevant, so I don't change it from deck to deck, but your meta sometimes grabs more 5s than it usually does. But other than that, I think that's it for GOAT. I'll probably make another video about siding, but now that you see the commonly used decks and their strategies, you can kind of figure out what to side for yourself. So that's it from me, and hope to see you guys goating in the future.